The United States of America, the great state. Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel. We're going to explore the origins of the United States, the world's hyperpower. How did this colonial breakaway from the British Empire become the hyperpower that it is today? Come join me as we explore the American Republic.
This isn't an ordinary fight. This is a fight between the powers of light and darkness.
We've extensively explored the United States in our explorations, and we're going to examine this rail map from 1875 when it was composed, and it was originally composed to celebrate the centennial of the United States. And you might be surprised to know that the United States was already completely divided out by 1875 when this map was made, and it includes the United States and the Dominion of Canada at the time. And we can see that it includes the wondrous infrastructure that had to be completed to support the railroad. Everywhere at the same time, the United States was rapidly constructed, and here we see an image of the differing United States Capitol domes, supposedly. It's also intriguing to realize that the geographical definitions of all the states seem to have been defined, and we had many centennials and world's fairs that had already transpired at this time, according to the official history. We can see that the fine geographical definitions of the states were already established. It's almost as though there was some sort of preconceived plan, and indeed the only states not divided in this map are the Dakotas into North and South Dakota, but everything else is as we know it now. We looked at certain states, such as Georgia, and we consider the early history of Georgia, namely the capital of Atlanta. Atlanta did not exist, really, prior to 1800 at all. It was a rail stop that was suddenly built up, destroyed in the Civil War by the Union Army, and then quickly rebuilt after the Civil War. It's an all too common story that we have. And indeed, most of the cities that we've explored in the United States didn't even exist before 1800, or they were simple settlements or forts, such as Nashville in Tennessee, another city that grew rapidly in the 1800s. And we've explored elsewhere across the eastern United States, such as Louisville, where we've seen wondrous architecture, and again, another city that rapidly developed and grew in the 1800s. And I don't want to forget to mention Cincinnati, one of my favorite explorations, where we saw a city that we're told was made by Germans, and Indianapolis in Indiana, a city that seems to be a terminus point. And of course, who can forget Chicago, where they had the Great World's Fair and several fires. So many cities that developed in the 1800s, to include Milwaukee with this wondrous courthouse and the large convent, visible from the river very easily. And going over to Minnesota and Minneapolis and St. Paul, two cities that grew very quickly. And indeed, many of these cities grew rapidly. We have courthouses, and we have Rochester in Minnesota, where the Mayo Clinic developed, and this wondrous courthouse in Austin, Minnesota. Of course, we see the brutalist example that remains to this day. And looking across this map, we can see that all these structures were completed at the same time. State capitals, county courthouses, infrastructure, railways, all done within the 1800s. Our favorite Iowa State Capitol, or at least my favorite, maybe you don't like it, and that's entirely okay. And yet, the presence of Iowa State College at Ames, and yet Ames, Iowa is not depicted on this map, even though it was originally constructed as a rail stop. Very interesting. We go out to Nebraska on the Transcontinental Railroad, and we can see the many communities that were along it, and maybe even see Gene Hackman when he thought he was dead, but he was actually just in Nebraska. I don't have anything against Nebraska. We can see, though, that the Dakotas have no infrastructure depicted in them, no railroads, and yet they rapidly grew. Recall our exploration of Mount Rushmore and Devil's Tower, and seeing the top of Devil's Tower in what is today Wyoming. And even back when this map was constructed, it was very clearly Wyoming. So many interesting things and wondrous achievements in a short 100-year period. And over here on this map, we even have some population figures and railway distribution in terms of how much mileage in each state. It's a very impressive set of achievements that's all illustrated on one map. Remember that the United States was a breakaway colonial possession of the British Empire. There was no reason for this wondrous experiment, at least we're told it was an experiment in government, to suddenly succeed. And not only did it succeed, it rapidly grew in under 100 years. all this infrastructure, all these bridges, all these railroads, all these state capitals, even the U.S. state capitol, the courthouses, and let's not forget the population. And you can certainly go back and look at the population video to see how unprecedented the growth of population in the United States is. Many will try to explain it by simply saying it was because of immigration. We also have our early governors, and some very interesting early governors, such as C.C. Carpenter, the governor of Iowa in the 1870s. Isn't it intriguing that they wanted to make sure everybody knew who the governor was and what their term was, even during this time frame? And who is the individual who made this map? Gaylord Watson? Did Gaylord Watson appear like Ben Stiller? Because we don't have an image of Gaylord Watson, which I find quite fascinating, and yet this was an official map that was logged in the Library of Congress. So what to make of this impressive map that shows us the incredible achievements of the American Republic in under 100 years? It's very impressive if it's taken at face value. But is this really to be taken at face value? Let's examine what the United States has become. And we went from a backwater colony to the world power, and that's depicted here in the Unified Combatant Command's area of responsibility, where the United States Department of Defense has divided up every geographical area in the known land, the world, the realm, whatever you want to call it, into geographical areas of responsibility, even violating the Posse Comitatus Act, which says that military cannot be used in a law enforcement role, but we're told that U.S. Northern Command was a practical necessity due to matters of national security, and therefore it exists. So regardless of concerns in earlier American times, they have Northern Command. They have a command that encompasses every single geographical area. And the intention behind this is so that there can be a division and a unified chain of command for the employment of American military forces anywhere in the land. Indeed, the United States is the only military in the world that divides up the entire world into geographical areas of responsibility. It's also the only military in the world, as far as we know, that has what's called expeditionary capability, the ability to deploy military forces to any point in the land. They even have a space command area. Now, whatever your opinion on this is quite an amazing change from what was just a group of colonies that was considered a backwater area. And there's even a book that's been written called Flight of the Eagle by this particular individual, Conrad Black, Lord Black, who is considered somewhat controversial himself. But whatever your opinion on the individual, this is the only novel or book that considers the strategy from America's rise. And we look at the founding fathers of the United States, the founding fathers which seem to have even come to a mythical status. And officially we're told the founding fathers were the signers of the Declaration of Independence, the composers of the Constitution, although we specify things a little bit more. We have George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, and a few others. Oh, I don't want to forget Alexander Hamilton. But these were the individuals who had these wondrous thoughts of creating a republic, a democracy. Even though things started to change, if we look at the 5 pillars of the original American Republic, we have faith in God, respect for the Bible, sinfulness of human nature, Christian virtue necessary, and government exists to protect faith and freedom. That's very different than the other aspects or perceptions that we have of the modern American state, where we say we believe in the separation of church and state. But of course, we understand that things were very different. People thought and operated very differently at that time. At least that's what we're told. Regardless, though, we have this conflicting account with the nascency of the United States. We also have many of these mythological images and these symbols that are so powerful. Lady Columbia, the Statue of Liberty, Uncle Sam. And yet when you look at a lot of the artwork that we've seen in many of these wonderful structures that were constructed in the United States, we see many mythical impersonations and even what would be considered folk art, such as this image where we see people paying their taxes. And I thought it was very fitting since it's April in the United States, and everyone in the United States knows what April means, unless of course you file for an extension. The symbolism is very interesting, though, with Lady Columbia and the aspects of innate wisdom. It almost reflects something that we could consider from the Greco-Roman pantheon of deities. Why do we see this so present in the United States? And indeed, in all the state capital explorations that we've done, we've seen some sort of reference to this symbolism, not symbology, but symbolism. And we've even seen it in many county courthouses and in other areas across the land. Indeed, every soldier and sailor's monument that we've looked at shows this symbolism to an extent. But what is this really reflecting? It's almost as though this is pointing back to another period of American history. Now, of course, we'll be told, no, that's not true. It's merely a sign of symbols that alludes to the myth and the folk art that represents what the United States was truly about. Consider the Lewis and Clark expedition. The United States doubled in size when it had the Louisiana Purchase, when it purchased that area from France. And President Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark, two U.S. Army officers, on an expedition to the Pacific to map out the terrain. Oddly enough, the French, who had been there for hundreds of years, had never bothered to map it out, or perhaps Napoleon didn't want to throw maps in the deal and just wanted to sell the land as fast as he could. Although it's now understood that what selling the land meant was that the United States could actually go and, how shall we say, occupy it. But we'll just call it what it is, conquer it, as there were Native Americans that were there, and we have the account of their guide, Sacagawea. And there were many other guides that supposedly took part in the Lewis and Clark expedition. But what was the real intention behind it? Do you just send a small party to go and explore and actually bypass a lot of the land that you're in, or were they looking for something else? There's a lot of anomalies when you go through this particular path that these individuals traveled on, and what's the real historicity behind this? Now, there's a lot of debate between the purposes of this expedition. It has been agreed upon, but if you ever go to Montana, you'll find that there's a lot of interesting sites that are there. Now, of course, we'll be told that these are just simple natural rock formations and that Montana is a very beautiful state, and there's certainly no arguing that point. Yet if you ever travel through it, you'll find that there's many of these odd examples with rocks, or rocks that some might be forgiven for thinking are not necessarily built by nature. There's many supposed surviving maps and first-hand accounts of the Lewis and Clark expedition, such as this, well, less than well-kept manner of notes in a map. That gives you the idea of what their expedition was really about and what they were focused on. And then you have other maps that were obviously more well decorated and, how shall we say, well composed, with more effort being put into scientific and accuracy with the distances and the locations and in terms of what they were researching. This is the Sergeant Floyd Memorial, and a very strange obelisk that exists near Sioux City, Iowa. And you might be surprised to know that there is something that is a smaller version of an obelisk of the Great Washington Monument in Sioux City, Iowa. Oddly enough, there's still the little commemoration that we have on it. They call it a shaft, and it's to mark the burial place of Sergeant Charles Floyd of the Lewis and Clark expedition. Died in his country's service, buried 1804. And then we see that graves of such men are pilgrim shrines, no class or creed confined. And it was erected in 1900 by the Floyd Memorial Association, United States and the state of Iowa. Very interesting, again, an almost mythical association with this incredible structure that still exists near Sioux City. They built this in 1900. Well, how come every set of veterans, especially from the Great War and then the War to End All Wars, which is the same war in World War II, didn't get such wonderful monuments such as this? Well, this was Sergeant Floyd from the Lewis and Clark expedition, and I suppose for some reason he deserved a great obelisk, and I'm certainly not denigrating the character of his service. I'm just saying it's a very impressive monument for one single individual. And yet we do have some construction photos of it, if you can call this a construction photo. Maybe you can. There's some peculiarities with it where it shows them allegedly finishing constructing the top of the monument. You'd think there'd be a better quality photo in 1900, but I don't know, maybe they just didn't have a very good camera at that time. And you can see, though, on the early maps at the end of the expedition, they still had Floyd's grave marked. Well, I guess the officers were very fond of this Sergeant Floyd. He really did his job quite well. I think of all the other non-commissioned officers, though, that have lost their lives in the service of the United States. There's many other aspects that reflect the myth and the folk art of the United States from the 1800s, and they give the impression of the concept of what was called manifest destiny. Yes, manifest destiny, apparently a strategic influence or a strategic goal of the United States to settle all the lands from the Atlantic to the Pacific. It's really hard to pinpoint, though, the actual origin of this strategy. You could almost say that it almost seemed preordained, and indeed Manifest Destiny almost says it's preordained. And indeed the individual that coined the term, we don't actually have a picture of him, we just have a sketch drawing of Mr. John O'Sullivan, and I find that very interesting that the individual that coined the term for a mythical strategic expansion westward. And we do have the same kind of symbolism that accompanies it with deities and the overwatching of the settlers as they moved west into areas that were untamed with infinite amounts of resources and land. At least that's what we'll be expected to believe. And it's rather fascinating that on many of these images you'll see trains and tracks, and then you'll also see trains that are traveling across open land without tracks. So is that to give us the impression that they had to build the train tracks rather rapidly, or was it just artistic license? Not really sure, but it's interesting that that's what we have. We have a lot of paintings and a lot of mythology that accompanies this, even though the camera had been invented and was fully in use during the Civil War. Although we always lament our complete lack of combat photographs, that doesn't necessarily prove or disprove anything, any more than the lack of photographs that really display manifest destiny really prove or disprove anything. Of course, people will say that if you just have an image of a small western town or one of those shack towns of wood in South Dakota, which we've explored and we have some interesting accounts behind, it gives another conflicting account. Ah, yes, Lady Columbia, who can forget, the great deity of the United States. It's very fascinating that we have this Lady Columbia, or the Statue of the Republic as it was called in the Chicago World's Fair in the early 1890s. Once again, almost showing a completely different origin for the United States. Are we to simply take these as national symbols, or was there some other inspiration behind their creation? Why are they so prevalent, especially in buildings? It's one thing to do drawings and paintings of all this, but when you lay out manifest destiny and the fact that all these structures were built very quickly in a short time frame in the 1800s, they all display these symbols. Now, of course, we have our theories that this could potentially represent a different origin for the United States. And perhaps that's what we really have to consider, that there is a different ideological origin. We'll be told that the roots of the American Republic or democracy actually come from the Greek originals, or the practice of democracy in Athens, and even the Roman Republic. And yet, oddly enough, we do see a combination of symbols that give us different indications for what manifest destiny really led to. And indeed, now the United States has a reputation for being a nation of excess, and yet it still claims to defend and support democracy. Here's a chart showing the estimated number of pioneers departing for Oregon, and you might recall our exploration of Seattle, where we saw a very tremendous growth of population within that particular area of the country. The population growth of Seattle from 1860 to 1960. And we're supposed to take this mythological interpretation of paintings and drawings along with these official documents and brochures that encouraged everybody to go west. Because you went through a hard journey to come to the United States from Europe, so you may as well go on another hard journey to go out west and tame this untamed land where there was no existing infrastructure at the time. And indeed, the railroad map is quite limited in terms of how much railway mileage there was in the United States in 1875. Of course, in the next 30 years, they quickly increased that exponentially, and let's not forget our changing of the rail gauge of 11,500 miles of rail in 36 hours. But remember, it was the 1800s. There really weren't any logistical limitations. They managed to build all this infrastructure, all these railways, all of these bridges, and all of these tunnels in a very short amount of time, as the map does indicate. 1776 to 1876. A series of wondrous achievements. A nation that not only was brought about by being a breakaway colony, and consider the wars that this nation fought. The War of 1812, constant conflicts with Native Americans, the Mexican War, and the U.S. Civil War. We saw the United States military struggle quite a bit in the War of 1812, and indeed it frequently struggled in its conflicts with the Native Americans. The legend of the last stand of Custer endures to this day. Somehow they managed to improve, though, in the Mexican War and then in the U.S. Civil War. The point being is that there were a series of very brutal conflicts, and yet it seems that the United States had its strategic mentality in mind, and that the United States Civil War was going to be fought so that the United States could achieve a more perfect democracy, and coincidentally it could also achieve a more centralized government. But let's think about that, because we're told that prior to the United States Civil War that the American states, such as Iowa, Georgia, they were really the representation. It's in the title of the United States. That, in other words, state identity or states' rights were what mattered to people. Well, perhaps the best way to look at that is in flags, and we're told that the United States needed to have a flag in 1777, and here we have George Washington with Betsy Ross approving the original design. But what exactly did the states have in the early period of the United States? So we would expect every single state in the United States to have a state flag, especially once they became a state. But you may be surprised to know that that's not the case. For example, we'll look at Minnesota in 1893, the first Minnesota state flag. In 1893, the Minnesota delegation to the Chicago World's Fair held a contest under the auspices of the state legislature to design a Minnesota state flag. The flag was intended to serve as a promotional tool for the state at its exhibition pavilion in Chicago. Amelia Hyde, Center of Minneapolis, submitted the winning entry. So we have a competition for our state flags, and I'm rather surprised to know that they didn't have a state flag for Minnesota. What about the Civil War? Well, when you look up here on this site, you're told that Minnesota's Civil War battle flags, in keeping with Union customs, several Minnesota regiments carried blue battle flags with a state seal in the center, including the 1st Minnesota, which fought at Gettysburg and endured great casualties, but certainly not because of General Hancock, and the 2nd, 4th, and 5th Minnesota. Most other Minnesota battle flags, however, had the American Eagle at the center by federal regulations. Many of Minnesota's battle flags are today displayed in the Capitol Rotunda. Well, that's Minnesota. Let's look at Iowa. Iowa was one of the primary states of the Union and sent nearly 10% of its population to fight in the Civil War, the war between the states. What's the origin of its flag? Well, they didn't have their flag until 1921. What? Iowa did not have a state flag until 1921? That's what official history says. There was a false flag that was apparently used by a tobacco company, but it wasn't the real official flag of Iowa. So let me get this straight. Iowa, one of the most, how shall we say, supportive states of the Union, and yet we're told that prior to the Civil War, states' rights and states' identity was so paramount, didn't even have a state flag until the 1920s. They didn't even have one for the World's Fair, and we know that Iowa had some great displays in the Chicago World's Fair, but they didn't have a state flag. How would anybody know about Iowa? Let's look at one of the southern states or former states of the Confederacy and the flag of Georgia. And indeed, you'll find that Georgia didn't actually have a state flag or anything like it until 1861. This is very strange. Well, let's just look at a timeline of all U.S. state flags, and you might be surprised to notice that virtually all of the U.S. states did not have any kind of state flag until the 1860s, which corresponded with the start of the Civil War. And indeed, you'll see that most of the states that did were the states that joined the Confederacy or seceded from the Union. Now, there are some exceptions, such as Hawaii, and maybe a few others. New York, but of course, New York being the original port of entry to the United States and it being around since the 1600s, of course it would have a flag. But for the most part, none of the states had any sort of state flag until the 1860s. This seems to be in contravention towards what we'd expect with the identity of the states in the United States. So what's the point behind all this? The point behind all this is that despite having the paramounts of symbolism, none of the states bothered to have state flags. The United States had to have its flag for the American Revolution, though, but the states supposedly had this great identity, but for the most part, it didn't develop until the 1860s. That seems to give us a very different perception than what we're taught about the identity of the American states. But what are your thoughts on this discrepancy that we found? So let's close this exploration by looking at the works of Erastus Salisbury Field, an American folk painter, and this is supposedly a colorized daguerreotype. Does this really look like any kind of picture to you, though? Very strange, and this individual is considered an American folk painter, and he was primarily active from 1850 to 1870, although the exact datings of his works are quite interesting. What kind of picture does he give us of America? Well, when you look at some of his works, he has a very interesting style of realism mixed with some sort of aspect of idealism. And you're probably asking, all right, why are we looking at an American folk painter? Because folk art is something that it's not necessarily a true reflection of what's actually going on. It's merely showing us exactly what we have in terms of myth. Indeed, we're told that he focused a lot of his works on biblical and classical paintings, such as the Ark depicted here. Now, if we go off the official account, then sure, we could easily believe that, but this individual also painted aspects of American history. And so could this give us the impression that the Ark of the Covenant was in the United States at some point in time? Now, I could simply be leaping to conclusions and there may be no reality behind it, but it's quite an interesting body of work that this Field provided us, or whatever his works was really representing, or were representing. This family portrait is rather interesting as well, and seeing some of the humanity in the images and yet some of the idealism. Isn't it intriguing when we think of what our perceptions of the 1800s are really like? And how do we form our perceptions of the 1800s? Well, I hate to say it, but the reality is it's from television shows, it's from certain paintings, and we'll look at folk art such as this. And this is where we'll derive our understanding of history from, because this actually puts it in image. And as we're constantly told, oddly enough by the United States Department of Defense as well, we're all visual learners. And so what are these images really representing? Is this the idealized individual from the 1800s? And indeed, he even did this interesting image that shows George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and some of the great Union generals, I say that with a little bit of sarcasm, from the United States Civil War, because while the military record of Ulysses S. Grant, who's depicted here, some of the other generals depicted on this painting don't exactly have the greatest reputation. Yes, of course, we have the old hand in the pocket. Why not? Very interesting representation, though, of Lincoln and Washington, and not typically how we're used to seeing them. Now, is this supposed to be some sort of real image, or is this just some sort of idealized image? And who do we have over here to the right? Well, this is supposed to be General Ambrose Burnside on the far right. Why is it we always have this reference to Ambrose Burnside? Because his military record during the United States Civil War was anything but remotely close to successful. Indeed, one of the most bloody, horrific Union defeats in the Civil War, the Battle of Fredericksburg, was brought about by this individual. There's also other odd artwork that Mr. Fields did, such as the Taj Mahal. Was there a Taj Mahal in the United States, or did he actually travel to India? Well, there's no real account of that, so why would he be doing an artistic rendering or look at the Taj Mahal? And then we look at some of his so-called biblical works, and yet we have another oddity with this, because is he really depicting biblical works? When you look closer at some of the detail behind this, though, there's nothing remotely biblical about this. This almost seems to give the impression of something a little bit more modern, or whatever was actually going on in the 1800s. Could it be that this is reflecting a different view of what truly transpired in the United States? Or again, is it just an ideal? Is it the fact that he really dabbled in different kinds of paintings and decided to do actual biblical representations and depictions, and also of Roman times? This is supposedly the army of the Pharaoh marching off, although how would anybody have any idea what the army of the Pharaoh marching off? And of course you'll tell me, well, he was just using his imagination. Of course he was. And speaking of his imagination, he did have a very unique painting called the Monument to the American Republic. This has to be one of the most unique and creative paintings I've ever seen from the 1800s. Where did this inspiration come from? Is this an amalgamation of different architectural stylings and paintings that he saw? Or does this represent something that may have existed in the United States? And again, I know you'll be saying speculation, but it's rather odd that during a time frame when people were certainly not encouraged to use their imaginations and had to be very pragmatic and very hard workers, because how else do you explain all that incredible infrastructure that was thrown up across the entire United States in under a 100-year period, then where was someone going off with their imagination being able to bring all this together? Or is it possible that this is a depiction of how something looked in the United States in the distant past? These very unique towers with all these columns. We're told that the artist was simply representing different folk art of America and showing American history. But why do they always call it the American Republic? And indeed, looking closer, you can see what's supposed to be historical events that are represented within the walls, on the columns, and yet we also still see the Roman Greco architecture. Well, you can easily hand-wave explain that away by saying, this particular individual, this painter, he liked to depict Roman and Greek origins in many of his paintings. So this doesn't necessarily reflect what was going on in the United States. But isn't it interesting we have such a conflicting account? What are your thoughts on the American Republic? What's the real history? Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.